A simple shopping trip turned into a nightmare. Rebecca, a successful black woman and pregnant, was violently thrown against her car by a cop, just for existing in the wrong part of town. He saw her skin color, not her humanity. But here's the twist. The officer had no clue who she was, or who her father was. When her retired police chief dad arrived, everything changed. This cop, once so full of hate, was suddenly begging for mercy. Curious about what happens next? Hit subscribe to hear the full story and see justice unfold. Rebecca Johnson's story began not with privilege, but with grit. Growing up in the south side of Chicago, a place known more for its struggles than for its opportunities, she had to battle not just poverty, but also the weight of expectations, both from her family and from a society that often saw her as less. But if there's one thing Rebecca's journey teaches us, it's that obstacles can either be roadblocks or stepping stones, depending on how you approach them. From a young age, she knew she wanted to design buildings, not just to leave her mark on the skyline, but to rewrite the narrative about who gets to build the future. It's no wonder that some of Chicago's most iconic structures are tied to her name, though many don't realize it's a black woman who stood behind those designs. Her rise through the ranks of a white, male-dominated field wasn't just impressive, it was revolutionary. The journey, however, was far from smooth. Alongside the applause and admiration, Rebecca constantly faced whispers and sideways glances from her peers, who questioned how she got to where she was. Was it luck? Affirmative action? Anything but talent, they often implied. And yet, despite the microaggressions, the doubt cast by those unwilling to see her genius, she continued to push forward. She didn't do it for the accolades or even the recognition, though of course, those came in time. She did it for her family, for her future, and for the little girl she once was, dreaming of something more while playing with blocks in her tiny childhood bedroom. And through all of this, there was a voice in her head, sometimes gentle, sometimes insistent, that said, "Keep going." But success, as anyone like Rebecca will tell you, isn't the end of the story. You see, when you climb that high, the air becomes thin, and the pressure intensifies. For every victory, there was a price to be paid. And for Rebecca, that price was being constantly reminded of her place as a black woman in America. Even after all her accomplishments, the burden of representing an entire race and gender never fully lifted from her shoulders. And as much as she tried to focus on her achievements, the weight of society's expectations still lingered in the background, reminding her that no matter how far she had come, the world hadn't fully changed. Now, at 35, Rebecca found herself at a new crossroads: motherhood. After years of pushing through challenges in her career, she was finally allowing herself to slow down. Though it wasn't easy. David, her husband, had been gently nudging her to take a step back for months. As a neurosurgeon, he understood the toll that relentless work could take on a person, especially now that they were expecting their first child. Rebecca wasn't used to being still, though. That day, as she wandered through an upscale baby boutique in downtown Chicago, her mind swirled with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Picking out tiny clothes and toys for their daughter-to-be felt surreal, like a new chapter she'd never fully imagined, but was now ready to embrace. Despite the joy that came with preparing for her child, Rebecca couldn't shake the underlying tension that often crept into her day-to-day life. Being visibly pregnant as a black woman in spaces like the boutique, a place where she still felt like she didn't entirely belong, made her feel exposed in a way that reminded her of past battles. The gazes, though subtle, carried the same weight as the stares she received early in her career. David always tried to reassure her, telling her that she had earned her place, both in her career and in life. But the sense of vulnerability didn't just disappear. Now, more than ever, she was reminded of the many ways her body, her presence, was seen and judged differently, even though she was simply a woman preparing for the arrival of her baby. As she moved through the store, trying to enjoy this moment of peace, Rebecca felt a shift. Life was falling into place after years of struggle, But the world outside didn't necessarily reflect that. She glanced at her phone, checking messages from David, who was making sure she was taking care of herself. The thought was sweet, but it only added to the weight she carried. The weight of being responsible, not just for herself, but now for a new life. Little did she know that soon, this peaceful day would take a sharp turn, forcing her to confront something she thought she had left behind long ago. Officer Mark Caldwell was a man teetering on the edge, and when he saw Rebecca stepping out of the boutique with expensive shopping bags, it was like striking a match next to dry kindling. His resentment, born from years of frustration with a career that had lost its shine, found an outlet in her. This confident, successful black woman in a part of town he didn't think she belonged. As Rebecca stepped onto the sidewalk, her mind still on her shopping and the baby soon to come, Caldwell's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. "What are you doing here?" he barked, his tone filled with disdain. At first, Rebecca wasn't sure if he was talking to her. Surely he wasn't serious. But the look on his face left no doubt. She tried to remain calm, as any smart woman would in such a situation. After all, she'd faced worse before, right? With a polite tone, she responded, explaining that she was shopping for her unborn daughter. But that wasn't enough for Caldwell. His hand was already on his holster, and the look in his eyes made it clear that he wasn't interested in explanations. "Let me see those bags," he demanded, his voice hard and accusatory. Before she could even react, he grabbed her arm roughly, sending a jolt of pain through her body, and shoved her against her car. "I'm pregnant!" Rebecca gasped, hoping for a flicker of humanity in the man who held her, but there was none. Caldwell's sneer only deepened. "Pregnant or not, you're still just another one of them," he spat, his words laced with venom. In that moment, Rebecca felt a mixture of fear, rage, and disbelief. How had it come to this? She wasn't just any woman. She wasn't just a successful professional. She was a human being, a mother-to-be. But to Caldwell, none of that mattered. As he began searching through her bags, violating her dignity and her sense of safety, Rebecca's mind raced. She had faced microaggressions before, but this was different. This was a full-blown assault on her identity and her body. And yet, even as panic started to take hold, there was a spark inside her that refused to be extinguished. She wasn't done fighting, not yet. Officer Mark Caldwell's day was spiraling out of control, and when he saw Rebecca, he found the perfect target for his anger. As she walked out of the boutique, her hands filled with shopping bags, his eyes narrowed. It wasn't just the sight of her success that set him off. It was everything she represented in his mind. With a cold, sharp voice, he called out, "Hey, you! What do you think you're doing around here?" The hostility in his tone was impossible to miss, but Rebecca, accustomed to brushing off such remarks, kept her calm. "I'm just shopping for my baby," she replied softly, hoping to de-escalate the situation. But Caldwell wasn't interested in her answer. His lips curled into a sneer as he stepped closer, towering over her. "Shopping? In this part of town? I doubt that." Rebecca blinked, confused by his aggression. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady, though her heart had begun to race. Caldwell's eyes flickered down to her bags, then back up to her face, the contempt in his expression growing. "Yeah, there's a problem. You don't belong here," he spat, his words dripping with disdain. He took another step forward, his hand resting on his holster now. "You think you can just waltz into this neighborhood and do whatever you want?" His voice rose with each word, becoming more venomous, as if Rebecca's very presence was a personal affront to him. "I'm just buying things for my daughter," Rebecca repeated, her voice shaking slightly as she glanced around, hoping someone would intervene. But Caldwell wasn't listening. He grabbed her arm with a force that took her breath away. "Let's see what you're really up to," he growled, yanking her toward her car. "What's in the bags, huh? Stolen goods?" Without waiting for an answer, he threw her against the side of the vehicle, her pregnant belly pressing painfully against the hard surface. "I'm pregnant," Rebecca gasped, her hands instinctively moving to protect her stomach. But Caldwell's face twisted into a cruel grin. Pregnant? So what? You think that matters to me? You're just another one of them, he hissed, practically spitting the words out. Rebecca's head spun. Was this really happening? Please, she tried again. There's nothing wrong here. Just let me go. But Caldwell wasn't done. Shut up, he barked, shoving her harder against the car. You think you're special? Just because you've got money? You think that changes anything? His voice was loud, drawing the attention of a few passers-by who slowed their steps but kept moving, clearly not wanting to get involved. You people are all the same, he muttered, rifling through her bags without her consent, tossing out baby clothes and toys with reckless abandon. You don't belong here, and I'm going to make sure you remember that. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to keep her composure. She had faced plenty of obstacles in her life, but this felt like an attack on her very existence. Officer, please, I haven't done anything, she pleaded, but Caldwell wasn't listening. His grip on her tightened, his eyes filled with a dangerous mix of rage and superiority. People like you always think they can get away with things, he snarled, leaning in so close she could smell the bitterness on his breath. Not today. The venom in his voice was enough to make anyone's blood boil, and Rebecca, despite her fear, felt her own anger rising. This wasn't just a bad day for him. This was deep, ugly hatred, and she was caught in its path. As Caldwell continued to rummage through Rebecca's bags, his fury seemed to grow with every innocent item he found. What's this? He mocked, holding up a tiny baby onesie. This doesn't look like something you'd buy. Who did you steal it for, huh? His voice was cold, his eyes filled with contempt as he tossed the onesie aside. Rebecca, still pinned against the car, could barely breathe. I didn't steal anything, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But Caldwell wasn't interested in the truth. His hand gripped her arm tighter as he leaned in, his breath hot on her face. Liar, he spat, his words sharp and cruel. You people always think you can get away with it, but not today. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of what was happening. This was more than just an abuse of power. This was personal for Caldwell. She could see it in the way he looked at her, as if her very existence was an affront to him. I'm telling you the truth, she said, trying to keep her voice calm, though inside she was panicking. I'm just shopping for my baby. But Caldwell's face twisted in disgust. Shopping? He sneered. People like you don't shop in places like this. You can't afford it. You think I don't know what's going on here? His words dripped with venom, each one designed to cut deeper than the last. You probably think being pregnant gives you some kind of pass, don't you? Like I'm supposed to feel sorry for you? The weight of his hatred pressed down on Rebecca like a physical force. Please, I'm not doing anything wrong, she pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. But Caldwell wasn't done yet. He grabbed her harder, his fingers digging into her arm as he pulled her back from the car and shoved her again. Shut up, he shouted, loud enough for people nearby to turn and look. You think anyone's going to help you? No one cares about you here. His words hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and for the first time, real fear crept into Rebecca's mind. She had faced challenges her whole life, but this was something else entirely. And the worst part? No one was stepping in to stop him. Just when things seemed like they couldn't get worse, a familiar voice rang out through the chaos. Let go of my daughter! James Johnson's voice boomed across the street, filled with a fury that Rebecca had never heard before. Her father, a retired Chicago PD sergeant, had arrived just in time. Caldwell froze, his hand still gripping Rebecca's arm, as he turned to see who had dared to challenge him. The moment Caldwell saw James, recognition flickered across his face, quickly followed by something else. Fear. This wasn't just any man confronting him. It was a former police officer, someone who knew exactly how the system worked and had the respect of both the force and the community. "Sergeant Johnson!" Caldwell stammered, his bravado crumbling as he loosened his grip on Rebecca. But James wasn't interested in pleasantries. His eyes were locked on Caldwell, burning with a rage that came from seeing his daughter, his child, being treated like a criminal. "Step away from her!" James demanded, his voice low but deadly serious. For a moment, Caldwell hesitated, clearly calculating his next move. He had already gone too far, and now he was face to face with a man who could ruin him. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Caldwell let go of Rebecca's arm, stepping back with his hands raised slightly, as if to show he meant no harm. But the damage had been done. Rebecca, shaken but relieved, stepped toward her father, who wrapped her in a protective embrace. "Are you okay?" James asked softly, his voice filled with concern. Before she could answer, his attention snapped back to Caldwell. "What the hell do you think you're doing, man?" James growled, his temper barely contained. "That's my daughter, my pregnant daughter, and you think you can lay your hands on her?" Caldwell opened his mouth to respond, but James cut him off. "You're done. You hear me? I'm going to make sure you never do this to anyone ever again." The threat hung in the air, and for the first time that day, Caldwell looked genuinely scared. The scene was already gathering attention. Bystanders had pulled out their phones, recording everything: the confrontation, Rebecca's distress, and now the fierce words exchanged between James and Caldwell. As more people stopped to watch, the tension only grew thicker. James, still furious, stepped back from his daughter just long enough to ensure that Caldwell faced the consequences. "Call your supervisor," James demanded. His voice was cold and unyielding, filled with the authority of a man who had spent decades serving the community. Caldwell hesitated, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment, but James didn't flinch. "Now." Within minutes, other officers had arrived on the scene, including Caldwell's superior, who surveyed the situation with wide eyes. The videos circulating on social media had already started gaining traction, and the last thing the department wanted was another public scandal. As the crowd grew, so did the pressure. The supervisor, clearly aware of the gravity of the situation, stepped in quickly. "Officer Caldwell, hand over your badge and gun," he said, his voice tense but authoritative. Caldwell's face turned red as he slowly unhooked his badge, handing it over with a mixture of disbelief and humiliation. "You're suspended, effective immediately," the supervisor added, his words leaving no room for argument. Rebecca, still shaking, watched as Caldwell was escorted away, his once cocky demeanor completely shattered. The public humiliation, coupled with the looming legal consequences, left him visibly panicked. James, standing protectively by Rebecca's side, looked Caldwell dead in the eye as he was led past them. "This isn't over," James muttered under his breath, loud enough for Caldwell to hear. And he meant it. As the crowd began to disperse, with whispers of justice and accountability filling the air, Rebecca realized that this moment, though terrifying, was just the beginning of a much larger battle. Her father had made sure Caldwell would face consequences, but the fight for justice was far from over. The viral video of Rebecca's confrontation with Officer Caldwell spread like wildfire, igniting conversations that extended far beyond just this one incident. Across the city and the country, people began to weigh in, many seeing themselves or their loved ones in Rebecca's experience. This wasn't just about one rogue cop. It was about a system that allowed men like Caldwell to operate with impunity for far too long. The outrage was palpable, with calls for reform echoing through the streets of Chicago. Protests erupted, not just in defense of Rebecca, but demanding an overhaul of the police department itself. Placards reading "No More Caldwells" and "Justice for Rebecca" flooded the streets as people rallied together, tired of seeing the same story repeat itself over and over again. Rebecca's story became a symbol, and her name was suddenly on the lips of activists and everyday citizens alike. But for her, It wasn't about fame or becoming the face of a movement. It was about survival, about ensuring that her daughter wouldn't have to grow up in a world where her very existence was seen as a threat. She had always fought for her place in the world, but now she found herself fighting for something much bigger. The media latched onto her story, turning her into an unwilling spokesperson for justice and police reform. As the protests grew, so did the calls for accountability, not just for Caldwell, but for the entire system that allowed people like him to thrive. And yet, for all the outrage and momentum, Rebecca knew that change wouldn't come easily. The system was deeply ingrained, with decades of policies and practices that protected officers like Caldwell from facing real consequences. But something felt different this time. The energy in the streets, the voices demanding justice, it felt like a turning point. "This isn't just about me," she told a reporter one evening. "This is about all of us. It's about every Black woman who's been told she doesn't belong, every family who's lost someone to police violence, and every person who's ever had to fight just to exist." Her words struck a chord, reverberating far beyond the city of Chicago. And soon, Rebecca's story became part of the larger conversation about Black lives, dignity, and the fight for justice in America. Moral of the story: Rebecca's story shows us how quickly things can spiral when power and prejudice collide. But here's the real question. How many times have you seen something wrong and said nothing? What would you do if this happened in your own community? I want to hear your thoughts. Comment below and tell me how you feel about this story. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you can stay updated on more stories like this.